Unfortunately, you need to be born with talent to get good at art. That's a lie. Because the only difference between the quote-unquote extremely talented artist and the regular artist is how their brain is absorbing information. You can practice all of the same things as the extremely talented artist, but if you don't practice in the right way, then you're going to end up forgetting everything. And as a result, you're not going to be able to apply accurately what you've spent hours studying. The expert artist is gaining 50 levels per study session, while the regular artist is only gaining 1 or 2 levels. And that's all because of how the information is being processed in the brain. Art is an accumulation of a lot of different tiny skills. And as a result, it's very easy for our brain to enter a state of overload, where it basically drops everything and the mechanism for learning shuts off. Let me show you with a quick example what it actually feels like for your brain to enter that state of overload. I'm going to give you a list of numbers, and I want you to add them up so at the end you have one total sum. Okay, 5 plus 2 plus 7 plus 18 plus 34 plus 86. Okay, you probably just felt what it's like for the brain to enter that state of overload, where it can no longer keep up with the information that's being thrown at it. And as a result, it taps out and drops all of the information. For us to avoid that same thing in art, we need to break art down into tinier pieces. And most art paths do this. And as a result, we have the fundamentals. But we need to do that same process of breaking it down into tinier pieces specifically with the fundamentals. And I'm sure that if you've just heard the advice of just practice the fundamentals, it doesn't do very much for progressing yourself in art. You can stay stuck in one fundamental for a very long time because the brain isn't actually absorbing the information properly. I'm going to show you with an example what it actually looks like to break down a fundamental to its base level so that we can take that information and store it into our long-term memory. This is going to be a 2-step process. So, for example, instead of diving into the complexity of a fundamental like anatomy, we need to break it down and turn that complexity into something very simple. For specifically anatomy, that would be basic shapes. Now, there's a lot of ways of simplifying anatomy that are taught. You can do spheres and cylinders, or you can do boxes and rectangles. My personal favorite is a little bit of a combination of the two of those approaches, but really you can use any approach because all of them work. They all get you towards the end goal. What matters is how you are practicing this fundamental. The purpose of simplifying anatomy into basic shapes is to make the brain understand what we're trying to draw. You as the person might understand intellectually that, head equals box and torso equals rectangle. But the brain doesn't yet understand it visually enough yet to accurately do it on the page. So we need to treat our brains almost like children and show it the most basic thing possible, and then we can start to build our way up from there. Or we start to add detail. But just like the number example, if we push too fast and get to levels that are too high for understanding, then the brain is going to drop everything. And you could technically start practicing or doing a fundamental that your brain isn't ready to understand yet, and you could stay stuck there for years because it's just in a state of overload. The reason I'm using other artists' work as opposed to real-life references is because anatomy is just so complex that the easiest way to learn is to look at how other skilled artists have simplified the anatomy so that we can learn from an already simplified base. It's basically, again, just allowing our brains to see the most basic thing possible so we can get the brain to visually understand what we want to be able to draw. Something that is very helpful for layering the information so it gets stored in the long-term memory is to take physical notes next to your drawings. Things like observations that you've been doing about how you're drawing. How big is the ribcage relative to the torso? How does the skin react to the stomach after the ribcage ends? Or you can ask questions that you aren't sure about yet that you'll have answered later. How does the stomach look when it's folding? Doing this primes your brain for the answers, which will make it so that when you learn those specific things, they get logged really deep into your memory. The science behind this is that our brains only hold on to information that it sees a reason for it to exist. And by asking that question, we give the brain a reason for the information to exist. If you want to go deeper into the science behind this, how to actually store information long-term, build your memory, and train your brain to recall shapes on command, this is exactly what we study inside of the Art Lab. It's the only place where I'm going to break down the full learning system step by step, how to actually structure your studies, how to activate long-term retention, and how to use memory loops to level up faster than just doing more reps. If you've been searching for a smarter way to learn art, this is where I'll guide you through the entire process. The next step in the process is very important because it's deciding when you should move on to a higher level. If you move on too quickly, there's gonna feel like there's an invisible wall in front of you where you'll spend hours studying a fundamental, but you can't actually apply it or connect it and get to the next level from anatomy to more detailed anatomy, like how the muscles react when you stretch the arm. And the process for mastering and checking if you have mastered a certain fundamental are actually both the same. They're contained in the same step. And for this, I'm going to continue to use simplified anatomy as the example. Once you've done your studies and your observations, you're going to move away all of your guides so that none of your drawings or any of your references will be in view. And then you're going to draw what you remember. When you do an exercise like this, you need to expect that these drawings aren't going to look very appealing. But the improvement is actually hidden in those lines that don't look super appealing. This is your brain literally showing you exactly what you need to study more to get better. You can imagine that your understanding for how to draw the body or how to draw the face are these balls of information that are floating around in your mind. And as a beginner or intermediate, these balls have a lot of holes in them. So when the brain needs to recall the information within these balls, it's going to be pretty scattered. So when you practice like this, where you study a fundamental and then you test yourself by putting everything away, you are looking to see how many holes are in this metaphorical ball of information in your head. And then you can test yourself again and see how well was that hole filled in. And the cycle repeats, and now progress becomes very tangible because you're observing and communicating directly with your brain. Your brain is telling you through your drawings that you still need to focus on this specific area, and then you go in and you're practicing on that specific area. By studying like this, you're doing two very important things. You're simplifying the fundamental. In this case, it's anatomy, which allows our brain to understand better what we're trying to draw. And the more of an understanding you have of a thing, the more of those holes of the metaphorical balls get filled, which keeps our brain from entering that state of overload. And the second thing is we're creating a very strong foundation where we can begin to layer the information. What this practically looks like is you first start off learning how to draw basic shapes, and then you start to add more complexity onto those shapes, adding more detail on how they interact with the body or how they look in perspective. And you can only do this if you're layering the information, because if you try to start up here on the pyramid of tasks that you have to learn, the brain is going to be in that state of overload. So we have to create the foundation and slowly layer it as we fill in those holes of our understanding. And mastering this process, layering the information properly, is what will allow you to be able to draw from imagination or be able to draw and create your own style. But both of those things are topics for another video. And again, you can put in any fundamental into these examples and just break it down to its first principles and practice and master level 1 of that fundamental, and slowly, gradually go higher and higher up those levels, testing yourself to understand how well do you understand this thing. There is the myth that 10,000 hours equals mastery. But the research in cognitive science shows that it's not about the hours, but it's how we organize the practice in the hours that matter. The top artists didn't just practice more to achieve their skills. They were deliberately practicing in a specific way in order to achieve their skills. They were absorbing information differently. They were either unconsciously or unconsciously learning how to learn, and then they were applying that directly towards their art, which allowed them to gain so many more levels per study session versus the regular artist who was trying to grind through a page of boxes, a page of copying references. And when you get yourself into an active loop, like the one in the example that I just showed you, where you study something actively and then use active recall to see where your shortcomings are, this is when you start to tap into what people call naturally talented. And then when you learn how to learn, everything in your drawing process completely shifts, and the output of your drawings, the drawings that you actually make, they also change as a result. If you want some more practical guides on how to directly apply this to your art, there's a free ebook down in the link description. I hope you guys enjoyed, and I'll see you in the next one.